Hey, I'm younger and prettier than your wife, aren't I? And I can make things so much more exciting. Yeah, you're right.
At the sight unfolding through the crack in the door, I was struck speechless, standing in dumbfounded shock. In the living room, my bare-naked father and my mother-in-law, Sally, were in the throes of passion. I wished it was just a dream. I didn't want to believe it. Shock, disappointment, sadness, a cocktail of emotions were swirling within me, and I felt sick. How could they do such a thing? They had betrayed our family. The last emotion to surge within me was a blazing anger. Leaving my phone at the ready, I took a deep breath. With determination, I kicked open the living room door in my anger. My name is Nancy. I am a working housewife, juggling both a job and household chores. My husband, David, and I got married about 5 years ago. We both work in the same department at the same company, and our personal and professional lives often overlap, leading to us naturally growing close without having to put it into words. After dating for 3 years, we decided to get married. I'm home. Hey, you must be tired on the overtime. Both David and I are busy with work, so we don't have children yet. My mother keeps pressing us to show her grandchildren soon, but we want to enjoy our time as a couple a bit longer. On a certain day off, I had gone back to my parents' house to pick up some clothes for the change of seasons. My parents' house is about a 20-minute drive from our place, close enough that I can easily go back whenever I want. It's reassuring to know that I can always rely on them if anything troublesome comes up. Once I had picked out all the clothes I needed, I headed to the living room, where my mother had brewed some coffee. How are things going recently? Is work going well? Yeah, it's going okay, I suppose. My mother and I sat down on the couch and exchanged updates on our lives. What about you, Mom? Any fights with Dad recently? I joked, but my mother's face clouded over at my words. I wonder what happened. Taking a sip of her coffee, my mother hesitated, then began, well, actually. According to my mother, my father had been acting strangely lately. My father had just retired from the company he had worked for many years. Since then, he hasn't had much to do and spends most of his time leisurely at home. Could it be that he's just lost without work? My father has always been a workaholic, seldom spending time at home. The absence of work, which had been at the center of his life, could be causing him to feel lost and confused. I had heard about such cases before. However, my mother shook her head, saying, it's not just that. His attitude towards my mother seems rather cold. Take dinner conversations, for example. He used to chat about entertaining events from work or how much he enjoyed the lunch. Just harmless, casual talks. But lately, it seems like he's just silent, moving his fork and barely continuing the conversation when my mother tries to engage him. It's also become quite common for him to awkwardly stand up and retreat to his room when she sits next to him in the living room, saying he's tired. She mentioned an increasing frequency of this oddly distant behavior. Are you sure you're not reading too much into it? Maybe Dad's got stuff going on. Well, if that's all it is. I had that conversation with my mother, then headed home for the day. As I prepared dinner at home, I reflected on my conversation with my mother. I had told my mother not to worry, but something about it was nagging at me. If it was just my mother overthinking, that'd be fine. But if my father was dealing with something, my father's getting up there in years. Maybe he's sick or something, and he can't bring himself to tell my mother. If that's the case, I'd want to hear him out. Maybe it'd be easier for my father to talk to me about it, even if he can't bring himself to tell my mother. I decided to bite the bullet and ask Dad the next time I saw my father. The following weekend, I went home again. My mother works a part-time job every Saturday. Only my father should be at home. This would be the perfect opportunity to talk to my father without worrying about my mother. Thinking this, I unlocked the front door. As I was about to open the front door, as usual, I abruptly halted. From the slight opening in the front door, I heard an odd voice. I hesitated for a moment about whether to turn back, but then decided to identify the source of the voice and stepped into the entrance. I walked down the hall as quietly as I could. The voice seemed to be coming from the living room. As I got closer, I wondered again if I should turn back. No matter how you slice it, it was an unsettling voice to hear in the middle of the day. But I'd come this far. I couldn't just go back to such an ambiguous situation. Summoning my courage, I put my ear to the door and listened in. I heard my father's voice, sounding like he was enjoying himself.
Come on, show me more. Hey, you're such an impatient one.
In response, I heard a woman's voice. Of course, it wasn't my mother's. When I heard that voice, I was a bit shaken. My mother-in-law! It was unmistakably the voice of my mother-in-law, Sally. There isn't much interaction between my in-laws and my parents. They are not supposed to meet unless they are on some special occasion. How did this happen? Even though my mind was blank, I managed to stay calm. I haven't seen what's inside yet. There's a chance I might be misunderstanding. I wish it were a misunderstanding. The thought of a parent and an in-law in that kind of disgraceful relationship makes me feel sick. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob of the living room. Trying not to make any noise, I slowly opened the door just a crack. What I saw next almost made me faint. The first thing I saw were two sets of clothes, scattered messily. The woman whose voice I had heard was indeed my mother-in-law. And on the living room couch were the two of them, in the middle of the act. This can't be! The shock was like being hit with a blunt weapon, my head spinning. So that's why my father's attitude towards my mother changed. They betrayed us, and behind our backs, they were doing this. This shouldn't be allowed, as a parent, or even as a person. Especially taking advantage of when my mother's not around to do this kind of thing. I won't forgive this. I absolutely won't forgive this. After the shock, I felt a burning rage. Even if they're my parent and in-law, if they've wronged me, I'll get back at them. I'll make them pay double. With my phone in hand, I glared at the two still in the throes of their act. It didn't take a minute for me to get ready. Taking a deep breath to brace myself, I kicked the living room door open with all my might. What the hell are you two doing? Shouting with all the anger I could muster, the two of them jumped like scared rabbits, looking at me with genuine shock. After a moment of silence, my father, who seemed to have recovered quicker, ran off without picking up his clothes. Wait a minute! Stop! My mother-in-law followed my father in a flustered manner. I chased after them, determined not to let them escape, and locked eyes with my father as he was closing the closet door. With a loud thud, my father and mother-in-law barricaded themselves inside the closet. Before I could think, I instinctively grabbed the duct tape that was within my reach and quickly began taping up the closet door. Noticing something was amiss, they started banging on the door from the inside. Hey Nancy! What are you doing? Quit your foolishness! That's my line. You should know what you've done. I layered the duct tape multiple times and blocked the door with a storage box full of clothes. Without wasting a moment, I pulled out my cell phone and opened the contacts. Upon pressing the call button, I quickly got a response. Nancy? What's the matter? The person on the other end was my father-in-law. He seemed a bit surprised as I seldom call him at this time frame. Hello? I'm sorry to bother you, but I need you to come over to our old house right away. Upon raising my voice so it could be heard inside the closet, a scream from my mother-in-law echoed out. Then, the sound of the door being pounded increased. No, it's not like that, Nancy! He invited me! I did nothing wrong! What the hell? It was you who initiated this. Completely ignoring the ugly argument behind me, I quickly called David and my mother. About 30 minutes later, my father-in-law, David, and my mother gathered at our old house. Nancy, what's going on? You even gathered your mother and my father here. I hadn't told the three of them anything about the situation. I just need you to come here. That's all I told them, and I headed towards the back room. Perhaps they had calmed down after some time, as the sound of excuses and banging from inside the closet had stopped. Maybe sensing our arrival, the atmosphere was tense. What on earth happened here? Seeing the dramatic scene around the wardrobe, my mother was confused. Just see it. As I moved the box aside, I began to tear off the duct tape. A scream was heard from inside, perhaps due to the sound of the tape. As I opened the door with all my might, my father and mother-in-law, who were unclothed, came out of it. What, Sally? No, John. In front of my bewildered father-in-law, my mother-in-law seemed to be at a loss for words. My father, avoiding our gazes, kept his mouth tightly shut. My mother, seeing my father in this state, seemed faint, and David quickly supported her. Well, let's hear your explanation. At my loud clapping and words, my father and mother-in-law visibly shook. After a moment of silence, realizing there was nowhere else to run, they began to talk about how they ended up in this situation. After you and David got married, we kept in touch occasionally. Covering her body with a nearby sheet, my mother-in-law spoke up. Apparently, at first, they were just talking about their personal lives and complaining about stuff over the phone. Over time, they started to see each other as more than friends and began to go out together. Then, after they'd been out drinking one day, in a drunken haze, they did that kind of thing. I couldn't stand to listen anymore and was about to cover my ears when my father-in-law, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. Startled, my mother-in-law clung to his feet. I'm sorry. I won't do anything like this again. You'll forgive me, right? Right? My father-in-law didn't say anything, just stared at her as she began to sob uncontrollably. After a heavy sigh, he said, Sally, we're getting a divorce. Hope drained from my mother-in-law's face. She had expected forgiveness, not this. No! Don't say things like that! Why are you being so harsh? Harsh? Look at what you've done. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? David, who had been supporting my mom, also came to stand next to my father-in-law. David seemed really angry too. In a quiet but sharp tone, he chastised his mother. Usually, my kind-hearted mother had a stern look in her eyes this time, directed at my father. After a glance at my mother, my father averted his eyes, staying silent. If that's the attitude you're going to take, I'll respond accordingly. Let's get a divorce, we should too. Whether he had anticipated this or not, my father still didn't say anything. As for the divorce, both of you should divide the property to us. At my mother's firm words, my father finally reacted. What? I can't do that. That's right. I don't have that kind of money. I'm retired, for crying out loud, echoed my father, and my mother-in-law joined in the criticism. After looking at them coldly as they made a pathetic fuss, I pulled out my phone. So, I can do whatever I want with these pictures, right? As soon as they saw the screen, they both gasped and froze. On it was a clear image of the two of them in the act. They clearly hadn't expected to be filmed, their faces turned a hilarious shade of green. I also have a video, by the way. If this goes to court, my mother and father-in-law can submit this as evidence. It'll definitely turn heads in the courtroom. To be honest, I wanted to delete it right away. I didn't want to keep such a disgusting thing. But if it would allow me to hold these two accountable, I could endure. Let me teach you something since you don't seem to get it. Okay? If you do something bad, you have to face the consequences. If you have any sense left, accept it gracefully. Okay. When I calmly stated this, my father fell silent again, and then reluctantly agreed to pay the division of property. About a week after that incident, my mother and my father-in-law and mother-in-law all filed a divorce. My father was kicked out of the house and now seems to be working day jobs. The other day, my father reached out to me saying, I can't afford it anymore, I need your help. After I hung up on him, saying, why don't you take responsibility for your own actions? I haven't heard a thing from him since. According to David, his mother has quit being a stay-at-home mother and is now juggling several part-time jobs. As I was relaxing in the living room, David, looking quite frustrated with his cell phone in hand, approached me. Hey, is it your mom? Yeah, I wish she'd just let it be. Apparently, my mother-in-law has also been reaching out to David several times, asking him to take care of the living expenses and accusing him of forgetting the kindness of his mother who raised him. David has been rejecting all her requests. I finally lost it and got pretty angry with her because she just wouldn't stop. Good job. I hope she doesn't bother you anymore. Yeah, I've blocked her number. If she still manages to get through, I'll change my number. Whether the blocking worked or not, we haven't heard from his mother since that day. And so, on a day off once all the chaos had been resolved, my cell phone, which was on the table, rang. It was a call from my mother. Hello, Mom? My mother had quit her part-time job because she had received a large sum of money from the division of property from my father. Also, my father-in-law, who was at the crossroads of whether to sign a re-employment contract after retirement and without hesitation, doesn't need to take care of his ex-wife anymore, so he chose to retire. How about we all go on a vacation sometime? Of course, with David's father as well. That sounds great. When shall we do it? This whole ordeal brought our family closer together. Recently, we have been going out together as a family more often. I've always liked being in a lively crowd, so this made me quite happy. Every cloud does have a silver lining. As I discussed travel plans with my mother, I couldn't help but smile, thinking about our future. Your parents are no good. Never invite them to our home. As my overbearing mother-in-law started to practically live with us and her constant harassment wore me out mentally and physically, my husband vehemently opposed when I tried to invite my parents over to our home. Why is it that your mother is allowed but my parents aren't? Because they're country bumpkins and it annoys me to be around them. Besides, you know that my mother and your parents don't get along, right? What if she gets stressed and falls ill? Anyway, who do you think allows us to live in this luxury condo? I don't need a wife who opposes me. If you're going to talk back, you can get out. David, uncaring of my feelings, turns back to the TV, sipping his coffee. In the height of my anger, I quietly approach him from behind. My name is Nancy Smith. 5 years ago, I married David, and we started our life together in a small apartment. Both David and I worked, and our annual income was $120,000. We didn't splurge and saved money, so we managed to accumulate quite a bit over these 5 years. One day, as I was checking our saving, David asked me with a curious look on his face. I've been thinking about moving somewhere else. It takes 30 minutes to get to downtown from here. Don't you think it would be convenient to live closer to the city center and the station? I was surprised and looked up at him. David was looking at me with a worried expression. I see, he noticed that I was getting tired. Lately, I've been working overtime and I'm so exhausted when I get home, I don't even want to do the housework. It takes about an hour to commute from home to work. When I was younger, I enjoyed the commute and used the time in the train effectively, but I'm 30 this year. The long commute is starting to feel like a burden. That might be a good idea. I'll find a great place, just like last time. You can leave it to me. Trusting David, I agreed to let him handle it. When we chose this apartment, he agreed to my request to choose one close to my parents' home. Both David's office and my office are located downtown, which made us lean towards a downtown condo. However, my parents were against that idea. They argued that it would be better for them to be close by in case of emergencies, and also cautioned us that living in a luxury apartment would become a problem if we didn't have sufficient savings. After being told this several times, I finally convinced David, who had been advocating for the downtown condo, to find us our current place. Since it was my idea, I found it difficult to bring up the subject of moving again. One of the things I appreciate about David is his ability to notice how people are feeling. Although he can be a bit carefree and reckless when it comes to money, he always prioritizes me. I was sure he would find a place that would be best for the two of us. However, when he began searching, he started looking for expensive high-rise apartments. When my mother-in-law heard we were looking for a place, she started gathering flyers and constantly recommending them to David. We told my mother-in-law through David that we wanted to find a place on our own, but she seemed unable to give up on her idea. She might have even been considering living with us. Regardless, I didn't want to spend unnecessarily, so I was hoping for a place that wouldn't cost too much, but it seemed David had a different idea. The apartments David was looking at cost around $3,000 a month. That was almost half of our monthly income. Looking at the cost, I was taken aback. I've always dreamed of living in a luxury high-rise. Don't you think that's a bit too much? Regardless of our savings, this amount is. The security is top-notch, it's conveniently located, let's go for this one. Surely even your parents would be convinced, right Nancy? I lost to David's passionate persuasion and we ended up signing the contract. David, I found a watch that would suit you perfectly at our favorite high-end jewelry store. Look, isn't it stylish? Ever since we started living in the high-rise that David picked, my mother-in-law started visiting frequently and practically living with us. She appears to be quite vain and seems to be bragging about her son's luxury lifestyle to the neighborhood. For some time after moving, David frequently invited his parents over to our place. My parents, on the other hand, haven't been invited over even once since we got married. Every time I started talking about my parents, he always changed the subject. I couldn't say anything against David's actions, considering my parents had intervened during our house search last time. I thought he was prioritizing our alone time. It could just be my imagination, but ever since we moved into the high-rise apartment, I've felt that things have become a bit cold between us. At first, she was just clinging to David and hanging around all the time, but lately, she's started complaining about me. "You are such a failure, can't even cook properly. If you feed this to my David, he's going to get a stomachache. Get rid of it now." "I'm sorry. I'll cook again." "No. We're going out to eat today, so you don't have to cook anymore. Your cooking is one thing, but you can't even clean properly. Make sure the entire house is spotless by the time we get back. Also, tell me your bank account information. Since this is all your fault, we'll make you pay with your savings. This isn't meant to be a nuisance, we're doing this for your own good. We're testing if you're suitable to be my David's wife. Everyone goes through this. Practice your cooking for next time." Saying this, my mother-in-law took David and left the room. David looked at me apologetically. Tired from the hard life of working on weekdays and spending time with my mother-in-law on weekends, I decided to talk to David after she left. I remembered that my mother-in-law didn't like my parents, and tried to invite them over under the pretext of reducing the burden, but David stubbornly refused. "Don't ever invite your parents. If you don't like it, you can leave. I've been thinking this for a while. Your parents are too country, it disgusts me. It irritates me being around them. Besides, you know that my mother doesn't get along with them, right? What if she gets stressed and gets sick? What? I've been tolerating so much and this is what I get?" I swallowed the words that were about to leave my mouth. David snorted, glared at me, then turned to the TV and started drinking his coffee. I silently picked up my mug from the table and left the room. "It's your mother who's gross," hovering over her son without ever cutting the umbilical cord and cooing over him. I wanted to fire back. But perhaps David had meant what he said. That thought kept me from retorting. I tried talking to David several times about how his mother was becoming a burden, but he just brushed it off or sided with her. I also could not accept that we were not allowed to invite my parents. On top of that, David's attitude towards me grew colder and colder, and there were times when he treated me like a housemaid. How can he be so arrogant? Does he truly understand the situation? What happened to the kind man he used to be? We're not living in this apartment solely because of him, are we? I'll never forgive him. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I made a decision. I'm moving out today. Don't regret it later. David's attitude remained unchanged. He seemed to think, let her do as she pleases. Perhaps because I hadn't mentioned divorce. Disgusted with the tiny part of me that was still hopeful, I left the room for the time being. Just 2 months after moving into the apartment, I decided to pack up and move back in with my parents. Speaking of which, I hadn't properly told my parents about moving to the apartment because things were so hectic. When they saw me suddenly back home, they were in a state of panic. "What happened with David? Why didn't you tell us about the move? What about your job?" They bombarded me with questions. However, in the end, they welcomed me warmly. I gave them the exact address of the apartment where I had been living with David until recently. If it's an apartment in this neighborhood, then it's managed by our company. Didn't that bonehead realize? I thought I had told him that it could be useful for future house hunting. Is that true? In that case. I remembered the condescending look on David's face and couldn't help but smile a grim smile. As it turns out, the apartment was managed by the company run by my father. To add to that, I was informed that there was an unbelievable footage on the surveillance cameras. I asked my father to show me the footage. I've never seen this woman before. Was he cheating? Unbelievable. The footage showed David deliberately coming back to the apartment during the time I was at work. Then after a while, an unfamiliar young woman entered the apartment. She was a flashy woman with lots of expensive-looking jewelry. Looking at other footage, there were images of him having secret meetings with different women. Despite the trust one had, to think I was betrayed long ago. There were no signs, like the scent of another woman in the apartment. How did he cover it up? I was certain of David's infidelity and decided to get a divorce. Payback time. So the words he swore in front of us at our wedding were a lie. I thought he was a bit of a playboy, but I never expected it to be this bad. I'll help out for Nancy's sake. My father and I headed to the detective agency to request an investigation into David's affair. The facts uncovered by the investigation surpassed our wildest expectations. David was currently having affairs with 2 women. The one he seemed most involved with was the daughter of a listed company. She seemed like a reserved and quiet lady. She could easily afford rent as high as the penthouse we lived in until recently. Looking at the list of women David has chosen, my suspicions turned into certainty. There was never love between us. The investigation by the detective agency was perfect, and every detail of David's affair was recorded in photographs. Even seeing these, I feel nothing. It's strange how cold I've become to someone I used to love so much. I wonder what kind of face he will make when I present all these facts to him. Thanks to the detective agency's investigation, it was also revealed that my mother-in-law was also living in the room in breach of contract. Finally, I've got all the evidence. Now I can get back at those 2. I pictured David clinging to me and smirked. I made a phone call to summon David and my mother-in-law. David, it's been a while. I need you to come to my parents' house right now. There's something important to discuss. The conversation will be brief. I'm a bit busy right now, and I don't know what this is about, so can we do it later? I'll call you back. David hung up the phone unilaterally. He's probably thinking I'm going to come back to him. What a shame. You will know what happens next soon. My father and I headed towards the apartment. It should be about time for him to meet his mistress. When we rang the doorbell, David came out. Long time no see, I decided to drop by. Oh, is there anyone with you? Sorry for the intrusion. Yeah, my friend. Oh really? A friend, huh? I casually tossed a bundle of documents from the detective agency at David. Pictures of the affair scattered across the floor, and the girl, a CEO's daughter who had heard the commotion, came out from the back. No, this isn't true, is it? She looked back and forth between the pictures and David, probably realizing what was going on. She seemed incredibly shocked, grabbed her bag and ran off. David stood there dumbfounded. Well, sorry to interrupt your rendezvous, but what's this about? Living here with your mother-in-law, who isn't a tenant, is a violation of the agreement. This apartment is managed by my company. Everything was reported to me, too bad. My father handed David documents related to contract violations. Unfortunately, I can't let you live here for $3,000 a month. If a contract violation occurs, appropriate action is to be taken as stated in the contract. All you need to do now is write your name here. David received the documents from my father without saying a word. He must have been in shock, struggling to comprehend what was happening. I pointed to the scattered papers at his feet, stifling a chuckle. And those photos on the floor. I had a private investigator follow you, so I know all about your affair. I even know about her. You took your sweet time saying you'd talk about it later, so I took matters into my own hands. She probably didn't even know about me, did she? But no, surely she did. I wonder if she'll ever come back to you. It's such a pity, she was a nice mistress to have. I told David that I decided to get a divorce. I'll never change my mind if he said something. Please agree with my decision. That's all I need from you. It'll be over soon, I told you that, didn't I? Finally grasping the gravity of the situation, David tried to plead with me. However, I paid no heed and made agree to file the divorce. The truth is, out of our annual household income of $100,000, I was making about $70,000. He must have found me quite the loss. After, unable to pay the monthly rent of $3,000 and the penalty for breaching the contract, David and my mother-in-law were forced to leave. I learned later that David had decided to quit his original administrative job while living with me, planning to start his own business, even though he was incapable of doing so. On the day I was moving out, he resigned in a grandiose fashion and was unable to take it back, thus ending up jobless. Now, I hear they live in an apartment over 50 years old. It's a one-room place with just a shower, and the rent is around $400. His mother says it's all David's fault for having an affair, and won't give him any support. David, with no money, seems to be having a hard time dealing with his self-centered mother who just loves to enjoy herself. I hope he understands a bit of how I felt now. If you don't live within your means, you'll end up like this mother-son duo, with your life falling apart. Living prudently rather than showing off might have less risk and lead to a happier life. I've decided that I will never end up like this mother-son pair.